Lecture 2, Moses and Monotheism, 1220 BC.
In our first lecture on the events that have changed history, we looked at the first law code, the law code of Hammurabi, a law code that still influences fundamental ideals of our country today, that we are a nation of laws, a law code that would be comprehensible in terms of its format and the aspects of the law with which it deals to a lawyer today. And the purpose of the law code of Hammurabi was to ensure equal justice for all the citizens of his great Middle Eastern empire. And around 1750 BC, when this law code was there in the great cities of the realm of Hammurabi, like Ur, one of the ancient Sumerian cities, it could have been studied by a wandering Bedouin, Abram, who would be destined to be the father of a great nation and of a great religion, Judaism. Abram would have been protected under that law code. He could travel in peace throughout the realm of Hammurabi by that law code, and even engage in mercantile activities. And he was described as a wanderer, that is to say, a Bedouin or a man who traveled throughout and did not have a fixed home many times of the year. Or, in the language of that day, he was a Hibiru, which meant a wanderer, a nomad. But he had taken up residence for a while in Ur and then left. And Abram would go on to become Abraham. He would be promised by God that he would establish a nation as numerous as the stars themselves. But perhaps not even he understood that he would be the father of three great religions that still influence the lives of billions of people today: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Late in life, Abraham was given a child by the Lord. A son was born to him and his wife. And that son, Isaac, God told him, you must offer up in sacrifice. And he did so. But at the last moment, God intervened and gave him a ram to sacrifice. But still today, throughout the Islamic world, Ibrahim is celebrated and held in the highest regard as representing the fundamental feature of Islam: total submission to the will of God. And there is nothing implausible at all in the biblical story of Abraham, his wandering out of the land of Ur, or in the fact that his descendants would then go and settle in Egypt. That Joseph, his descendant, would be brought to Egypt as a slave. For our historical records make it very clear that there was a large business activity in slaves coming from the land of Iraq and being sold in the markets of Egypt. Nor is it implausible that Joseph, using his wits, would rise up and become the grand vizier of the Pharaoh, perhaps second in command under Pharaoh. Because all through the history of the Middle East, there is a record of slaves rising up and having positions of great authority. Nor is there anything at all suspicious about there being famines, and Joseph being able to bring into the land of Egypt, into a land of plenty, his relatives, these wandering Hibiru. And so too, the very central event of the Old Testament, the very central event of Judaism, the Exodus out of Egypt and the revelation of Moses. And that spiritual event, that conviction by one man that he had been chosen for this great task by God, that changed the spiritual history of the world. For we must always remember that ideas are even more powerful than guns, than the mightiest armies. It is the idea that ultimately changes history. And that one individual who has the courage, the power, the belief to overcome all obstacles to realize that ideal. And so it was that we are told there rose up in the land of Egypt a Pharaoh who no longer knew the people of Joseph, who no longer treated them with the regard and respect with which they had been brought into the land of Egypt, and in fact had reduced the Hebrews to slavery. And indeed became so concerned about the number of foreigners in Egypt that he issued the savage order that all the male children would be put to death. Well, that may not be actually true, but there were considerable indications in Egyptian records at various times of xenophobia and wanting to expel foreigners. And so the story of Moses takes us to Egypt, takes us to a child born of the Hebrews, but raised up as an Egyptian. It is most interesting to look at this historically and to understand the name of Moses as being a traditional Egyptian name. We find it as a part of a number of names like Thutmoses, Ramoses, names of some of the greatest pharaohs. So Moses is an Egyptian name. And we are told that he was raised to be a prince of the royal family. But one day he saw an Egyptian beating savagely a slave, slew that Egyptian, and then had to flee the land. And he too became a wanderer out in the distant parts of the desert lands of the Middle East. And as an old man, married, just following his flocks, doing his ordinary task, one day he heard a voice boom out from the sky and saw at his feet a burning bush. "Take off your shoes, for you stand upon holy ground," the voice told him. "Who are you?" Moses said. "I am who I am. I am who I am." No visual portrait of a God, very different from the gods of the Middle East or of Egypt. Those gods were portrayed in human form, and in fact, the law code of Hammurabi shows him receiving the law code from the great god Marduk, portrayed as a mighty king. But this God of the Hebrews, who announced himself to Moses, revealed himself to Moses, is simply I am who I am, would be called Yahweh. "What do you want with me?" asked this old man. "You are to become my prophet. You are to speak forth, and you are to go down into the land of Egypt and bring forth my children." Well, somebody that old, the last thing they want to do is to become a prophet, because nobody ever listens to you once you're past a certain age. You're no longer a young dynamo with fire in your belly. So no, he doesn't want to be a prophet. And two, he most certainly doesn't want to travel. And third, why should he worry about bringing Hebrews out of Egypt? So he is, like many prophets, reluctant. And God tells him, you're going to do this. The same God that demanded Isaac be sacrificed by his father Abraham. You're going to do this, Moses. And Moses thinks of every possible excuse. Not only am I old, but I'm a very poor speaker. And this voice becomes agitated and says, look, I'll give you your brother. He's a good speaker, but you're going to go down into Egypt. And so he does. Goes down into the land of the Pharaohs. And there in the portrait of the Exodus, we move perhaps into an ideal world in which Moses is allowed to come before Pharaoh, this God on earth, and demand that this whole segment of his slave population be freed. However, there is a historical context to this. And the Pharaoh of the Exodus can be, and I think should be, identified with one of the most powerful of all the Egyptian pharaohs, Ramses. And a date around 1250 BC is not at all implausible for these events. And Ramses, ruling over Egypt for a very long time, Ramses, who led the Egyptian army to a victory at Kadesh in the year 1274 BC against the Hittites, the first battle in history that is known to us in any detail, who signed a peace treaty with the Hittites, one of the first treaties in history between two great nations, the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian Empire, to be known to us in any detail. Ramses is a real historical figure, and we know that the longer his empire went on, particularly as a result of his mighty struggle against the Hittites, the economic consequences of that warfare, that attempt to expand the Egyptian empire, had caused economic problems in Egypt and discontent. And so, in Exodus, Moses goes to Ramses and demands that my people be let go. They've been employed, the Hebrews have, in building cities. And we know that Ramses was a great builder of cities, as he was a great builder of monuments to himself. Many of the mightiest temples you see in Egypt today were originally built by Ramses. Still today at Abu Simbel, high up on the Nile, there are the titanic statues of Ramses that he had erected to himself. And why should he? A Pharaoh of such might let these people go out of Egypt, these Hebrews. And who is Moses to make this command to him anyway? God then says, I will send plagues upon you. And Moses explains this, and plague after plague strikes the Egyptians. And still Pharaoh again and again hardens his heart. Until at last, the most devastating of all the plagues comes. We've already seen in the law code of Hammurabi how dear a son is to his father. And so too in Egypt. I will take away your firstborn son of all the Egyptians, says this God Yahweh. For the God Yahweh of the Old Testament is a God of vengeance, a God of war. And the Hebrews are told to prepare their last meal in a particular fashion and to mark their doorways with the blood of that lamb, so that God will pass over those homes, but bring death to the children of the Egyptians. The Passover, still today, 3,200 years later, celebrated by Jewish families all over the world, reflecting a real historical event. For I'm quite convinced that the Old Testament rest upon the strongest possible kernel of history. And after this terrible event, this death, that set of deaths that brings sorrow all through the land of Egypt, finally Pharaoh agrees. And the Hebrews start their trek. You can even follow it basically on a map, how they go out. And in the Exodus tradition, Pharaoh once again changes his mind and comes after them with a mighty army, an army that has chariots, which indeed were the fundamental offensive weapon of the Egyptian army, these war chariots. And they come chasing after the Hebrews. Now, we're told that the Red Sea parted. Of course, many modern scholars would doubt that. Many ordinary people would doubt that. And there are always attempts to rationalize it, find a different place where this must have happened, or just say that it was tides breaking out. Well, fundamental to the Bible, whether it's the Old or New Testament, is the belief that miracles occur. They are the authoritative testament of the power of God. And so, in the Exodus tradition, these waves part, and the Hebrews are able to pass across. Then the waves come back down and destroy Pharaoh and his chariots. Well, no, the Egyptian records don't mention any such destruction of an Egyptian army by the Red Sea, nor the death of a Pharaoh under these circumstances. But there was enough history in that, so that the oldest single sentence in the Old Testament, dated at least that way by the language, is the song that was sung by the Hebrew women in the celebration of this great miracle. The horse and the rider he is overthrown into the sea. Let us celebrate the name of God. Thus the Hebrew people came out of Egypt and began their traversing the great Sinai desert. And nothing is more realistic than all the trouble Moses gets from having saved these people. They began to whine, they began to complain. Why were we brought out of Egypt? There at least we had enough to eat. Now we're brought out here into the middle of the desert to perish. Even the provision of food for them doesn't satisfy them. The people of Moses that he has led out are ungrateful, stiff-necked. But God has led them out in the biblical tradition for a purpose, to make of them a great nation, to fulfill the promise made to Abraham. And there in the Sinai desert, the site of a monastery we could still visit, where we could even stay. Moses would go up onto the mountain in the tradition, the Bible, and there God would give him the 10 Commandments. Well, we have seen that law codes existed in the Middle East, that the law code of Hammurabi was said to have been given to him by God. Indeed, it was inscribed on great tablets. And the law code that we have today, the copy of it there in the Louvre, shows Hammurabi receiving this law code from God, from the god Marduk. So there's nothing at all out of historical context with at least the idea that Moses would receive a law from God. Now, it is not the elaborate law that Hammurabi received, spelling out property rights and other rights that are still familiar today. Like one of the articles in the Law Code of Hammurabi says, I will not be responsible for anybody else's debts. How many times do you read that in the newspapers these days? No, it did not have all those elaborate legal aspects. It is a very simple code. And it starts with God, just as the law code of Hammurabi starts with God as the giver of the law. I am the Lord thy God, who led thee out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You will have no other God before me. The second, you will make no graven images of me. You will not take my name in vain. The third commandment. And then you will keep the Sabbath holy. 6 days of the week you will toil, but on the seventh you will rest. That too, the idea of dividing a week into 7 days, is a Babylonian invention. These first 4 commandments are devoted to God. I am the Lord thy God. I'm a jealous God. You will have no other gods except for me. So it is a religion of complete monotheism. That sets it apart from all the religions of the Middle East and from the religion of Egypt. They were polytheistic. The Mesopotamian, the Babylonian, the Egyptian did not believe that they could set a limit to the divine universe. In fact, they were always willing to recognize new gods when a power manifested an ability to render benefits to the community beyond the power of humans. So they were polytheistic. This was monotheism and only one God. Then the 5th of these commandments deals with your parents. And if you look carefully at the 10 commandments, they are divided into the first 4 that establish the relationship of the people of Israel, as they will become, to God. The next ones, 6 through 10, deal with your relations with people, humans. And the 5th is the bridge between the law of God and how you're to act to people. That, of course, is honor your father and mother. And that is one of the most fundamental prescriptions in the Code of Hammurabi. the honor that is owed, the respect that is owed by the child to the parent. And in the same way, the accountability, the responsibility of the parent to that child. So your parents are a bridge between the rest of the world and God. It's still a ideal worth remembering and pondering in an age in which the family has split apart and the extended family almost doesn't exist anymore. And then we are not to kill. We are not to commit adultery. We are not to steal. We are not to bear false witness. And we are not to be jealous of others. Kill. And that is what I think it says in the Hebrew. Not murder, but kill. For that is the blanket indictment of God, to kill. But as with all of the codes, all the commandments, they do not operate in the world of God, they operate in the world of humans. And soon the Hebrews would have their prescriptions about what would be a just war. Adultery ranks very high on the list of the commandments you're not supposed to do. Why? Because it is breaking a fatal trust with another who is the closest one to you. And then stealing, very harshly punished. You'll remember in the law code of Hammurabi, still harshly punished in the Islamic world today, where the law can still say you must have your hand cut off if you steal. And then bearing false witness, just lying. And finally, to be jealous. And the Hebrew, like the Greek, saw in jealousy this powerful force, one of the most destructive elements in human society. So such was the revelation to Moses. But it did not remain, of course, just a revelation to a wandering tribe, Hibiru, out in the middle of the Sinai. It became a fundamental event that would change history and which still prescribes a code of action and a code of belief for billions of people throughout the world. For Moses and the people he led out were not going to stay there in the desert. God had also promised to them to fulfill the promise made to Abraham, that the Israelites would occupy the holiest of lands, the land of Canaan. Moses, as Martin Luther King Jr. will tell us later in our course, knew he would never get there, but he saw it. And then the Israelites took the land of Canaan by fire and by sword. And if the archaeological record does not allow us to follow the path of the Exodus, it certainly demonstrates with awe-inspiring force the destruction and violence and burning and death that accompanied the capture of the Holy Land. For it was taken by the sword, and this God was a God of justice, but also a God of vengeance, demanding that the Israelites cut off the foreskins of their enemies and pile them up in honor to him. Or that a town would be totally destroyed and every two- and four-legged creature in it slain. And so the Holy Land was indeed captured. Now the name Moses is, as I told you, an Egyptian name. And circumcision, which became the fundamental initiation rite for a male of the Jewish people, is almost unique to Egypt. The Egyptians also did not, interestingly enough, eat pork, but circumcision. And it was this name of Moses and this circumcision that led the very profound mind of Sigmund Freud to write his book on Moses and monotheism and to argue in a most genial fashion, one that disturbed archaeologists and historians, but one that still has a great deal of interest if you read it, to argue that the religion of Moses was, in fact, derived from Egypt. For 1 century before Moses, in the middle of the 14th century BC, one Egyptian pharaoh, using all the might of that office, sought to change the whole current of Egyptian religion. Akhenaten was his name, and he came to believe that all the gods that the Egyptians worshipped were in fact just manifestations of one supreme God, the great god Aten. And with his own hand, he would inscribe glorious hymns to this god Aten. How that God was universal and one, that we must have no other gods than that God, that God demanded righteous behavior, that God was too powerful to be envisioned in any human or animal form. Even the sun disk that might somehow represent him was but a faint reflection of this one God who simply was the God who is. And the sun itself was but a reflection of how this god Aten brought to the whole of the universe warmth and love and prosperity. And indeed, what he wanted most of all from those who worshiped him was righteousness towards him and generosity towards others. A God who loved children, a God who loved even the tiny chick chirping inside his egg. But people are very hard to change religiously. And the vested interest of the Egyptian priests were absolutely against this rebel Pharaoh Akhenaten. And finally, his whole religious movement collapsed, and his name was struck out of Egyptian inscriptions. And he was referred to, if he had to be referred to, simply as the criminal. But there were followers. And Sigmund Freud believed that this idea of monotheism, this idea of a God of justice and righteousness, of universality, that God who is, that idea continued to percolate throughout Egypt, and that Moses was not a Hebrew. Moses was an Egyptian. And Moses took this group of people, led them out in order to preserve this idea of monotheism, introduced the rite of circumcision among them because that was the Egyptian way. And thus, the monotheism of Moses went back to the rebel religion of Akhenaten. Well, we can dismiss this if we want to, but it is a fascinating example of the power of this one revelation to shape human history. Christianity would, of course, come from Judaism. And the Ten Commandments take a center place in the Christian religion. Adapted somewhat, we must say. After all, the second commandment is violated every day in churches about not making a graven image. Adapted, but nonetheless, the Ten Commandments and the revelation of Moses are fundamental to the ideals of Christianity. And no name is mentioned more often in the Quran than that of Moses and Abraham. And Muhammad saw himself as fulfilling, ultimately, the role of prophet once played by Moses. And of course, the Ten Commandments to the founders of our country represented in their purest form the idea of natural law, of that law that is binding in all places and all times because it comes from God. And indeed, throughout the world, no matter what your religion or lack of religion, people would agree on 1, respecting their parents, 2, not to kill, not to steal, not to lie. So fundamental natural truths. But perhaps most extraordinary of all the people and nations and religions that passed through the Middle East and its history, across the stage of its history, only one endures. No one speaks ancient Lydian anymore. You won't find anybody who carries on day-to-day conversations in Akkadian. I don't think you'd find anybody much that worships Isis or Anubis or Marduk. But every day, the Word of God in the book of Exodus speaks. The language of the Hebrews is the language of the nation of Israel today and throughout the world. The Jewish people continue their ancient tradition of worshiping the great God Yahweh. Why?